Here's why I will never use Pep Boys again, and would strongly urge friends and family to avoid bringing their vehicle to Pep Boys as well. This is particularly true of the Pep Boys located at Forest Avenue in Staten Island. At the onset, I do not typically post negative reviews. We all have bad days, we all make mistakes, and posting feedback that follows any business on a mistake is something I typically try to avoid. But this mistake was so dangerous and so costly, and their failure to own it and take significant steps to correct it through 3 separate interactions with the vehicle was so absurd that it seems less like a simple error and more like something endemic in their corporate culture. I'm going to redact the information of those involved for their privacy. I'm also going to do my best to give Pep Boys a fair shake in this, but they ultimately cost me over $3,000, and that amount is continuous and ongoing as I am speaking. This will be a 2-part video. The first is going to be the backstory. The second part will be what occurs after the case is litigated. Now, the staff was courteous. That does not change the fact that they installed my brake pads backwards and destroyed the new rotors that they had installed, as well as both rear calipers that had been there. Don't take my word for it. This is the technician at Mini of Edison, New Jersey, explaining the error and what the consequences of that error was doing to the calipers and rotors.
When I inspected the rear brake pads, they were within spec, as you can see here. But when I looked at them closer, they were installed backwards. Since they were on the outside incorrectly, it's rubbing on the caliper and not braking correctly in the rear.
So here's the backstory. On November 11, 2023, I took my wife's 2016 Mini Countryman in for all new tires. I knew that the rear brakes would soon require changing. It is not my custom and practice to bring any of my vehicles in for major maintenance at any of the chain repair places, but those of you familiar with automobiles, even as a hobby, know a brake and rotor change is quite a simple fix, even modern vehicles and on vehicles that are more complicated to repair like the Mini. So I opted to change all 4 tires and the rear brakes at Pep Boys. Those of you familiar with doing this procedure also know that this is a prime opportunity to inspect your rear wheels and calipers, as both have to be removed to install the new brakes and rotors. Those of you familiar with the business practices of these chain vehicle repair shops know any wear and tear is usually brought immediately to the attention of the customer in the hopes that they'll opt to have the repair done at the shop. My car was delivered without mention of the calipers or any other defect in the rear wheels. This is my wife's car, and she regularly has our son, so I performed a thorough test drive and did not immediately notice anything out of sorts. Over the course of the next 2 days, my wife reported an odd whining sound in the vehicle, and when I drove the vehicle again, I noticed a metal-on-metal sound consistent with friction in the rear wheels. I returned the vehicle to Pep Boys, and they reported that not 1, but 2 calipers in the rear had failed. Both calipers. Now, in fairness to Pep Boys, caliper failure does occur, and is something that can happen following a brake change. The caliper, which contains a hydraulic piston, now has a pad with a greater thickness, so having a defective caliper does happen. But the fact that it happened on both calipers, bilaterally, in the area they just repaired, giving nearly identical symptoms of rub and wear on both sides equally, suggested there was something more to this story. I directed them to perform no further action on the vehicle, and I'd be taking the car to a dealership, which takes some time. When the technician at Mini put the vehicle on the lift, these were his observations with respect to the symptoms in the rear wheels.
Onto your concern from a rubbing noise when braking. When I was looking over the rear brakes, did notice quite a bit of rust buildup on the rotor here and a groove, as well as it looked like it was normally wearing here. When I inspected the rear brake pads, they were within spec, as you can see here. But when I looked at them closer, they were installed backwards. This pad that's currently on the outside is meant to be on the inside of the brake pad, so the sensor can bolt into it. Since they were on the outside incorrectly, it's rubbing on the caliper and not braking correctly in the rear. You can see the sensor is actually on the outside pad. It's supposed to be on the inner pad. So these rear brakes were installed incorrectly. There's also severe rust buildup due to the pad only contacting the outer part of the rotor. So we're gonna have to I'm gonna recommend replacing the rear brakes complete. These pads will be unevenly worn, as well as the rotors.
Did you catch that? Not only did Pep Boys perform brake pad replacement backwards, but they had been so committed to doing it that way that they had to run a sensor connecting the inner pad actually to the outer pad. Thinking Pep Boys would make this right, I contacted them immediately. They told me they could do nothing without seeing the vehicle first. To their credit, they offered to tow the vehicle from Edison, and I declined. So for the third time, I brought the vehicle to Pep Boys. The manager in this interaction tried to stand by their failure, gaslighting me into the notion that there was no distinction between the inner and outer pads. This is asinine, especially now knowing the sensor is even on a specific pad. They doubled down on the fact that both calipers failed. I believe the calipers had indeed failed now at this point after the negligent installation. As a final offer, Pep Boys agreed to perform the maintenance. I declined this offer for two reasons. First, they still insisted on charging me the labor involved in repairing the consequences of their own neglect. Secondly, replacing the caliper is not as simple as a brake pad removal and installation. It involves opening the hydraulic brake system, and if I could not rely on Pep Boys to perform a simple brake installation appropriately, I could certainly not allow them to mess around with the more complicated components. Instead, I opted to have the vehicle towed to Mini at a cost of $400. There, the same technician who saw the vehicle before informed me Pep Boys had reversed the prior backwards configuration, but not before the damage had already been done to the rotors and the brake pads. I will also now need new brake calipers. The total cost will be over $2,500. This is in addition to the towing costs and now rental vehicle costs, since the calipers they destroyed are on back order. In New York, the threshold for small claims court is $5,000. In other words, to sue for more than that, I will have to sue in civil court. Now, the beginning portion of this video was edited over 3 weeks ago, and the amounts you're about to hear are significantly different than the $3,000 that I mentioned at the beginning. Those reasons will be explained. A rough draft of this video was originally posted as unlisted. Out of fairness, I sent a link to Pep Boys Corporate for comment, and they responded right away. They were courteous and professional and advised they would be opening a claim, and also seemed receptive to taking responsibility. However, the last people to operate this vehicle since posting the unlisted clip were the service technicians at Pep Boys. Again, they informed me that I needed new calipers and said nothing of any additional noises or defective conditions. As mentioned, the vehicle had to be towed from Pep Boys to Edison, New Jersey, where it waited over 3 weeks for calipers on back order before they could complete the repair. After the repair was complete, the service technician at Mini noticed a noise in the differential that was not present either when I or the service technicians at Pep Boys had driven it before. I drove out to Mini to test drive the vehicle myself prior to authorizing the repair, and I observed the noise, which was loud enough and concerning enough to raise my suspicions of a differential problem. Cost of a differential? Approximately $6,500. Now, the most likely culprit in this differential failure was the towing company, who I will refrain from naming publicly prior to commencing an action, because as I mentioned earlier in the video, I am disinclined to post negative feedback on a simple mistake as opposed to the repeated failures I experienced with Pep Boys. Upon information and belief, the differential failure likely occurred because the towing company did not use a flatbed to tow an all-wheel drive vehicle 22 miles. It should be noted, however, during one of my final interactions with Pep Boys, I extended the opportunity to them to have the vehicle towed from Pep Boys to Mini of Edison in an effort to help them mitigate the costs, which I will explain in greater detail in part 2. They declined, but between the towing, the rental vehicles, the brake repair, and now the estimated cost of the differential repair, my out-of-pocket costs are more than $10,000. By the way, I say estimated cost of differential repair because as of the date this final video was posted, I am still awaiting the vehicle, which means additional rental costs. To put it more concisely, choosing a brake repair at Pep Boys cost me over $10,000. This is why I will never use Pep Boys again and would strongly urge others to avoid them as well. To be continued.